Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the book launch of So Many Windings by Catherine Mcdonald. I am so pleased to be here for this spectacular event. It's been a long time coming, and yeah, it's just going to be a great evening. My name's Matt Jodry, and I'm the publisher of At Bay Press. It's my great pleasure to have published this fantastic book by a fantastic writer. It is the second book in Catherine's Charles Lauchlan series, and it's a ripping good yarn. A few bit of, we'll call it housekeeping items and a little bit of preamble here before we get started. The first thing is that we would like to acknowledge that we are transmitting live tonight from Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The second thing is that throughout the event, you are more than welcome to ask any questions of the panelists. And to do so, you can type your question into the chat. You can actually write it in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the toolbar on your screen. Or if you have a loud enough voice, you can shout it out and I might hear you all the way here in Winnipeg. Hard to say. But without further ado, we may as well move forth here. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the host of the evening. The host is Michael Bumstead, owner of Whodunit Books, Whodunit Bookstore here in Winnipeg, and a great partner of At Bay Press, and we are so thrilled to have partnered with them on this amazing launch. Welcome, Michael Bumstead.
Hello, that would be me. So I would like to thank everybody for coming. I'd like to thank Matt for being what will soon be the sort of ghost behind the curtain for all of the following steps. We've been really thrilled at Whodunit to be able to do these kinds of things with At Bay, and have been so thankful for Matt and especially his technical expertise as we try and navigate the various forms of this day. As Matt has already mentioned, we at Whodunit also acknowledge that we live and work in the territories of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Dakota, the Dene, Métis, the Oji-Cree nations from the Treaty 1 territory as signed in 1871. And with that in mind, we are thrilled to be able to have all of you from within that territory or outside of it join us today to launch a book that we are especially excited to have, because it is the sequel to a book that was at one time one of the most popular launches we had ever had in our old store. Now, Matt is making some videographic images showing the cover. The cover, of course, is this one with this very fine landscape, So Many Windings, and it is written by the next person to come onto our screen, Catherine Mcdonald, who I would like to now bring forward from behind the blackness of just her name. There she is. Thank you, Catherine.
Here I am.
And that's my cue to exit. So
All right.
Enjoy, everybody.
Now, before Catherine gets into doing a short reading for you, a reading I'm told is going to be precisely 1 minute and 17 seconds. I do have to forewarn everybody that there is a possibility that there might be some breakdowns in our internets, at which point we will just simply wait for everything to catch up to ourselves. And if required, I don't know, recite all of the elements, or maybe all Agatha Christie's in order. We'll find out. But before Catherine even begins, we also have to say that there is a door prize for this event that I'm sure almost none of you were certain was going to be there. And that on behalf of At Bay Press and Whodunit Bookshop, you will be the first person to have signed up for this event is actually going to be receiving a signed copy of this book, The Unpleasantness at the Battle of Thornford, the recently nominated for the Canadian Crime Writers Award novella book. And that is going to go to the first person who signed up for Catherine's launch, which will not surprise, I don't think, Mrs. Catherine at all. It's Anne Morton, who signed up within 19 minutes of the launch of the original statement. So congratulations, Anne, and we will figure out how to get this to you. So, Catherine, you have a new book. It has come out today. Congratulations.
Thank you.
All right. Do you want to give us any context for your reading, or do you just want to jump into it in all of its glory?
I will give a little bit of context. This is a letter written by Charles Lauchlan to his friend, Sergeant Andrew Satter. Both men are in Scotland on holiday. Charles is in Edinburgh and Satter is in Orkney. And with that, I will just begin reading this letter of Charles to Satter. We had dinner with the Burning Bush sisters, the Mrs. Thorburn and Miss Gardner mentioned above. All did not go as planned. The sisters are leaving in 3 days on a bicycling tour of the Highlands. They were describing the trip in the most exciting terms, and we were quite enthusiastic on their behalf, until they asked, wouldn't we like to come with them? Maggie, who ignored my kick under the table, said, why, that would be so grand. Another kick. We'd be thrilled, wouldn't we, Charles? Charles did his best to look thrilled. So much for walking arm in arm on Castorphin Hill and intimate suppers at that little restaurant near the Grass Market. We had one of those conversations on the way back to Miss Semple's. Why on earth did you say yes? Well, they took me by surprise and I couldn't say no, and they've been so kind to me, and they're really such dears. And besides, it's only 10 days. Wouldn't you love to see the Highland from a bicycle? And it will be an adventure, and there'll be no question about propriety with them there to chaperone us. Yes. So that kind of sets up the book.
Yes, indeed. Now, presumably, and I actually know the answer to this question, there is, of course, going to be a murder involved in this bicycle tour across Scotland. But first, I thought that you and I might have a quick word about what it felt like to return to the world that you'd created and put on the Armour of Light. Here, available, also for sale. And returning to Lauchlan and Maggie and Satter and to these characters that you had created for your debut novel in a follow-up book.
Well, I knew I wanted to carry on the story fairly closely in time from the first book. But initially I had no idea what was going to happen with the characters. And initially I thought I would set the second book in Winnipeg, as the first one was. But then I got to thinking, I had sent Maggie off to Germany to study at the end of the last book. And I had set it up that Charles would take a group of theological students to Germany and meet her there and come home with her in a year's time. And, you know, both those characters, as I do, have Scottish roots. And so I thought to myself, why wouldn't they stop off in Scotland and look around and visit family and all of that sort of thing? And that idea just sort of really intrigued me quite a bit because of my own personal background. I've got Scottish roots, and so many Canadians have Scottish roots. And the early 20th century was that time when Canadians started to come to Scotland to commune with their ancestors. So there it was, Scotland. So the first book is in Scotland, or the first book is in Winnipeg, this book is in Scotland, and then the third book will be back in Winnipeg.
Now, with that in mind, and I know that you and I have spoken about this many years ago before, once upon a time, but for, I guess, at least some of these people who have never heard you speak about this before, or who haven't heard you speak of this before, Lauchlan, when I read this book, particularly reminds me of that early 20th century, the most famous of those sort of Manitoban authors, of a protagonist that comes out of a Ralph Connor book, you know, especially, and not to just spoil too much of this, as he pursues the murderer across the Highlands with this sort of like positive ecclesiastical air of fitness and the benefits of good health and peace to all who I come upon. And I thought perhaps it might make sense for us to at least briefly discuss some of those inspirations for your amateur detective.
Mm-hmm. So I basically have no imagination. So a number of my characters started off being suggested by real people, and Charles Lauchlan was the first of them. The book started in my head after I had read Charles W. Gordon's autobiography, Postscript to Adventure. And in it, he discusses his romance with Helen King. And I thought to myself, that's a really interesting story. I bet that would make a good murder mystery if you wound a romance through it. And that was kind of the concept of the first book. And so having no experience of writing fiction, I immediately did heavy research on Charles W. Gordon until I realized that no, my job was to make things up. So all that is left of Charles W. Gordon is the name Charles, pretty much, and the fact that he was a Presbyterian minister. And so Charles Lauchlan became himself. He evolved to become himself.
He still swims so beautifully.
Which is, yeah. Yeah, this parallel with C.W. Gordon's, who was, of course, using the pen name Ralph Connor, probably the most famous Canadian of his generation, and sold millions of books worldwide, did develop this kind of muscular Christianity that was very appealing to that generation of Canadians and Americans in particular, in that it brought sort of Christianity down to a kind of daily level that people could really relate to, and wasn't sort of obscure and exalted in any way, but very, very down to earth and practical. So of course, Charles Lauchlan is that kind of minister. He's that kind of guy. He's, you know, he'll sing in the next book, by the way, which is also one of the things that C.W. Gordon did.
Wow.
He sang in the first book too, actually.
And a teaser for all of us to be excited about. Sorry, the sun has changed quite dramatically from when we tested these positions for the cameras for Matt the other day. So I'm using my notebook to pretend that I'm not going to blind myself. Now, you do also have in this second book some characters who are also inspired by historical figures. Most prominently, of course, the Mrs. Thorburn and Gardner, who you mentioned in the introductory letter, who are based on Agnes Smith Lewis and Margaret Dunlap Gibson. Now, for those who are familiar with the first book, they are also surely aware that Maggie, now Charles's fiancé, is a suffragette and fits in with that movement. Now, how did it feel to be taking more from that sort of vein of these early 20th century women or late 19th century women who were sort of eschewing traditional values and moving forward and using them as character bases as well?
Well, I absolutely loved finding these amazing Scottish sisters, who are referred to as the Gibloos, by the way. And thank goodness you said their names, because I can never remember them. These amazing Scottish sisters who mounted their own expedition to the Sinai, through the Sinai Desert, to go to St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Desert and discover there one of the earliest New Testament manuscripts in Greek that had been discovered at that time. And the next year they came back, having taught themselves photography and photographed every page of this manuscript in order to take it back and publish a facsimile of it. I just thought they were so incredibly adventurous. And again, I have no imagination. So these two sisters became the basis of my two characters, two sisters in the book. And once again, they started off being quite similar to the Gibloos, but they evolved to be themselves. And I mean, one of the themes of my books is the development of women straining against the strictures of their lives in the early 20th century and beginning to flex muscles and agitate for voting rights, and to break into universities. That's another thing that interested me a lot, was the fact that the Gibloos kind of were breaking into the scholarly world of biblical studies, where they were not welcome and where they had to make their own way. And they did that, assisted greatly by their wealth. They were extremely wealthy. So they were just very apt models for the themes that I wanted to draw out, and for my character Maggie to become an ally of theirs.
Yes. And of course, one of the reasons that we then find ourselves with a crime scene at all is these characters inviting our lovebirds, our affianced, on a bicycle trip. Now, Catherine, I know that you want to make certain that your bicycling bona fides are well established in the most public versions possible. So would you like to explain to people, A, why bicycling was of such an interest to you, and B, why bicycling through Scotland on these particular kinds of tours was of specific interest, before I blind myself or lose feeling in my arm? Pardon me.
Right. Well, I have no imagination, but I have gone on one long distance bicycle tour, which just happened to be my honeymoon with my husband, biking from Fredericton to Charlottetown some time ago. And of course, what we're talking about at the beginning of the 20th century is the golden age of the bicycle. People were doing amazing things on bicycles. And it was true that there were bicycle tours. People were touring all over all over Scotland. And it is more amazing when you consider that they were not using geared bicycles, because the Sturmey Archer gearing system was not patented till 1902. My book is set in 1900. So what that meant was that you may have heard that Scotland has hills. So what they would do is they would actually push the bicycles uphill and then ride downhill, although sometimes they did have to walk the bikes downhill too, because of the incredibly bad state of the roads in the Highlands in particular at that time. So, but people were doing these amazing things on bicycle. I did a week's research in the National Library of Scotland. And I found that one guy had bicycled from Stirling to Inverness, which is a distance of 156 miles in one day. And, you know, like there are hills in between those 2 points. There are several mountain ranges, in fact, including the Cairngorms. So this was quite an amazing feat. So this was all very interesting. And I thought to myself, well, if I have a group of cyclists thrown together, most of whom had never known each other before, then I would have kind of a one of those closed room mysteries, sort of a moving closed room mystery.
Yeah.
And that was kind of what I was aiming at.
Yes, and have succeeded because you have knit, as somebody who probably, given that this is the launch, presumably not as many of these people has read this book as possibly could have. You have done a remarkable job of knitting all of these themes together. And there is, however, some parts of your writing style and your writing expertise that fall far outside of mine. And so in particular, to sort of have a conversation about writing mysteries involving clergy, and to give myself a break and maybe find a new position to sit in the office, I would like to introduce an expert on the subject and a local author as well. Doug Whiteway, who writes as C.C. Benison, will now be joining us. Doug is the author of the book that we have just given away, and recently nominated for the Crime Writers of Canada Novella Prize, which will soon be revealed, I believe. And I am now going to take a background to a space for Doug and Catherine to have a conversation about, well, I'm not certain. Are you starting with letters or are you starting with priests?
Oh, let's start with priests.
Mm-hmm. Right, because that's something that our books have in common, right, Doug?
That's right.
We both have members of the clergy as protagonists.
Now, there are pros and cons. I found there was some enormous pros, actually. Just the fact that as an amateur, you can get into other people's homes and into their lives fairly easily in the way, say, I don't know, an insurance salesman couldn't necessarily.
That's right. And another thing about members of the clergy is that, as you say, they can be in all sorts of different places and no one will question their presence there, but also they tend to be with people at the most important points of their lives, you know, weddings, funerals, baptisms, but also, especially in the era that my guy is in the early part of the 20th century, you know, psychotherapists hadn't come along yet. So, you know, if you were going to share your feelings and have deep questions and need counseling, you might very well go to a priest or a rabbi or an imam. So I think these qualities of members of clergy are what makes them so popular as amateur sleuths. I mean, and there are just such a slew of clergy types in the sort of mystery canon. There's rabbis and nuns and priests and imams and Buddhist priests, and I think there's an endless seam there to mine.
Yes. Well, and they can also be involved in moral dilemmas that sometimes the police aren't. The police are kind of agents of the government or the state, and that their prime role is just to solve the crime, not necessarily think about its moral implications. So that intrigues me somewhat too.
Right, and me as well, because I mean, my character is really concerned about the state of people's souls and their spiritual lives. And deeply concerned about the kind of the rending of the moral fabric when a murder occurs, for example. So those are things, I mean, good policemen and who are deeply sensitive are probably, you know, concerned about that too, but
It's not part of the job description.
no, exactly. So, yeah.
There is a con though, and that's that they don't have the whole range of you know, of inquiry that a policeman have. They don't have the, well, yours is set a century ago, so there's no issues with DNA and CCTV and fingerprints were around, but they don't have access to that. So somehow you always have to skirt around or somehow be slightly always ahead of the policeman. In my case, I can make the policeman slightly inept or bumbling, so my hero can be a bit ahead of them. But your policeman is a fine fellow.
He is a very fine fellow, and he's of course he's, you know, if you have to have some access, some way of your protagonist, your minister in my case, to have access to police knowledge. And so, of course, the way this is often done is to give the character a friend who is a policeman. And that's what I've done, because it's really, that's the awkward thing about having the amateur sleuth. They have to be somehow forever meddling in police business and have some way of doing that legitimately.
Right.
So my guy's got a friend who is a copper, and that's handy. But you always have to somehow fix it. If your guy is going to solve the crime, then you have to figure out some way of stopping the police from being able to do that somehow. And in this book, I had geography on my side because it was actually true that the Highlands were extremely remote in 1900. There were telegraphs offices on the towns that were on the railway lines, but there were no telephones. So communication really was a problem. And if you're out in these remote climes, you're sort of thrown back on your own devices. So that's been my little friend in sort of delaying the police response.
Right. Actually, that makes me think about the perils and pleasures of doing a historical mystery. You always have to be careful, as you mentioned earlier with the bicycle, what year you're in and what may have been invented and what may not have been invented, what is an anachronism and what isn't. I'm the one I'm working on now is set in 2010, and I'm even finding it, I ask myself, well, which version of iPod did they have, or iPhone, or tiny little things like that? So you would be along the same line, but only worse, I would say.
Well, I mean, the research for this book was such a lot of fun. I did a little bit too much of it at times, I have to say. But I mean, what did we do without, you know, the internet? Because through the magic of Abe Books, I was able to, for example, get tourist guides from that early period so that I could know what hotels cost and a lot about the railway timetables and all of that kind of detail that would not have been available any other way. I was even able to find guides that were made specifically for bicyclists of that time that talked about what the road surfaces were like and where the hills were and what the angles of the hills were. Just amazing stuff available. And what will we do without Google Earth and without YouTube? I mean, insane people mount cameras on their cars and drive down the very roads that you want to see. It's just amazing. And I got lost in it at times. I had to remind myself, oh yeah, I'm writing a book, right? We get back to that.
You and I too also use letters as a way of moving the story along. Now, why did you choose letters, the epistolary form?
Well, I chose letters because I read your books.
See, no, all writing is
Yes.
borrowing, as they say.
Yes, not only do I have no imagination, but I plunder others at my will. Letters, I mean, I'm a former archivist, and I spend a lot of time reading people's letters. Most of those people had been dead for about 100 years, but I used to say that it was the only way that you could, read other people's letters without joining the Secret Service. And I mean, people really express themselves when they write letters, and you can do such a lot of character development through writing in the character's voice. It's really, and you can get a lot of kind of plot explication out on the table too, such as your character Madron in your books, the Father Christmas's housekeeper who writes faithfully to her mother every week. And of course, Madron knows everything that's going on in the village, right?
Right.
And you're able to slip in details that would be kind of hard to do or a little boring in any other way, because Madron has such an individual way of writing, and you've included all of her cross-outs.
Yes, that was fun.
She doesn't have access to spell checkers, so she's forever misspelling words and crossing them out. And, even that says a lot about a character. So I just think that letters are an excellent way to move things along and to let the reader in on how a character is feeling, particularly about other people in the book.
Right.
So thanks for that, Doug.
Oh, no problem.
I
My pleasure. Yeah, no, I enjoyed writing them too. I based mine on the letters my mother wrote to her sisters, and they always had crossings out. They just sat down and completely unselfconsciously wrote letters every week to each other. And of course, when you and I do it, I mean, we're trying to make it look unselfconscious, but of course it takes, a certain amount of consciousness to make it look easy, I guess. I had the pleasure of reading
the other thing about letters is, sorry, say again.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, the other thing about letters is what they don't say, what it is that they don't say in the letter, reading between the lines. Government official letters, for example, would be good examples of that. So studiously crafted to evade committing themselves to any course of action, but also characters just writing informally, just the way the things that they don't say can be just as important.
That's a good point. Interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Thank you for that. I read your manuscript a year ago, and it had a different title. I'm wondering why the change. The new one is good, because there are so many windings, aren't there? But
it was supposed to be, yeah, this is just, I think, must happen frequently, or at least it's happened twice to me anyway, in both my books, that I've come up with a title and just at the very last minute, somebody else has gotten a book onto the shelves with the same title. This book was supposed to be called 50 Words for Rain, because I figured, Scots have at least 50 words for rain in all its guises. So I was happy with that title, but, some New York Times best-selling author beat me to the punch with a book set in Japan called 50 Words for Rain. Apparently they have rain in Japan. And so I had to be at the last minute choosing another title. So that's how it became So Many Windings.
Okay. I like it though.
Have you never had to retitle a book?
No, but
I
the
guess-
titles of mine are so kind of obvious in a way. There's
Yeah.
Death in Buckingham Palace. Well, I didn't know, it's sort of the title it had to be. There's one I wrote called In Cold Type, and there was a lot of toing and froing about that, finding it. But the other ones were fairly settled, and there was no competitive title that I know of at the time.
Doug has been very fortunate in that all of his titles have preceded somebody writing a very similar book that they then have to slightly alter.
Ha ha.
Hmm.
Yes, I think
He's back. Because he is the obverse of you, Catherine, who have had to change your book all the time. Doug is often just ahead of somebody who wants to write about historical murder at Sandringham House or at Buckingham Palace or at Balmoral. And then they either have to just accept that Doug has beaten them, which sometimes they do, which leads to a great deal of confusion in bookshops.
Oh.
Which is why we appreciate, Catherine and Matt, you guys making changes so that we don't have to sell more than one copy of 50 Words for Rain and have to figure out which one it is that people actually want.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with that in mind, and thank you, Doug, we do have some questions. We do have a number about your cycling, Catherine, which I think that mostly has been answered, although Molly McCullough is wondering if you've ever toured Scotland by bicycle.
Aha. Okay, well, she's got me. This is my niece, by the way.
So presumably she already knows the answer to this question.
I'm ashamed to say that we did tour we did go to Scotland, and we did tour the route of the tour in the book. However, we drove because we are somewhat older than we were when we rode from Fredericton to Charlottetown. And there are even bigger hills in Scotland than there are in New Brunswick. So the better part of valor was to take a car. Thanks for the question, Molly.
And yes, and as somebody who most of the letters after my name come from Scotland, I would never want to bicycle anywhere there. I had trouble bicycling the 4 kilometers from my apartment to the university in Aberdeen because every direction that I ever bicycled, there was wind in my face. You could never figure it out. You would turn, you would go east and then north, and the wind would still be there. And you would go back home, and you'd go east and then south, and the wind would still be there as well. Now, we do have another question. This one is from Bev Peters, and I think this is actually one that is relevant for both of you. Although I would recommend that you not ruin any of your books by revealing this, but they are curious as to whether your sleuths have ever been held up or stymied by the presence of the Sabbath.
Aha. Well, yes. Guess what? The Sabbath falls on, I think, the day of the murder in my book, and is one of the reasons why the policemen are prevented from getting to the scene of the crime just immediately, because there's only one train running on the Sabbath in the Highlands. Yes, it was a definite fact of life, and still is to a certain extent in the Highlands, that everything comes to a halt on the Sabbath. And I used that as a plotting tool in ways that I cannot reveal at this moment. You'll just have to read the book.
And Doug, let's direct the same
How about
question at you. Sunday.
No, mine are set in a contemporary period in England, and as far as I can remember, I don't think it has affected the movement of the book.
Perhaps something for 9. What do 9 do in this series? Do ladies leap?
They dance. They do. Yeah, nine ladies dancing. Sorry, God, I should know this.
of all of the 3 of us, there's one person who should know what order.
Leaping or dancing, or I don't know, marching.
Now, there is space and time for more people from the public to offer questions, but I do actually have one of my own because that is the kind of bookseller that I am. Now, I wonder, and this is actually for both of you, is it easier or more difficult to take so much time between writing in series? Doug, you have recently finished The Unpleasantness of the Battle of Thornford, and Matt, on the other end of that white screen that I don't know if anybody can see right now, is very hopeful that you will be writing 9 Ladies Dancing. And that was something that you came to after having left Father Christmas, featured in the first book in the 12 Drummers Drumming here, after quite some time now. And Catherine, at the same time, put on The Armour of Light, featured here, came out quite some time ago before what used to be called 50 Words for Rain and is now called So Many Windings and was launching today, is happening. Now, did getting back into the rhythms of those characters feel like it was more difficult, or was it something that was easy?
I never sort of left those characters, you know. I mean, it just takes me super long to write a book, so years and years. They were with me every day, so there really wasn't, in my mind, a gap. There was a heck of a lot of research going on, so I would say no. That doesn't, you know, they were in my mind at most times, and there was no real putting down and picking up again. Over to you, Doug.
Well, there was a fair gap for me, but I was surprised that they were all more familiar to me than I thought they might be. It was just details I had to look up. And so fortunately, you know, thanks to the wonders of a computer, you can find those deals. There was details quickly through just searching through your old manuscript. So, but otherwise the feel of them felt reasonably fresh, actually, surprisingly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now to take a step back, I should say, and in the same order of answer, if that's all right. Heather Louis is asking that, do you think relatives who were clergymen influenced the development of Charles Lauchlan's personality, but also presumably Father Christmas as well? If, Doug, you have any priests in your lineage?
I have ministers falling out of my family tree like crazy. I mean, that was one of the reasons that I started writing books with ministers as a protagonist, because, you know, if you're just starting off in fiction, you write what you know. And my grandfather, my father, and my brother were all ministers. So I grew up in a clergy family, and I knew kind of the rhythm of a minister's life. And so that came very naturally to me.
And I'm the opposite. There are no clerics in my family tree that I know of. So, and my undergraduate degree is in religious studies or comparative religions, but believe me, a few courses in Buddhism do not help with these sort of books. I was lucky enough to have an advisor in England, a priest at a church in the very village, which is the model for my fictional village. And he sort of guided me through this and that. And of course, there's the wonders of the internet and books. And I do have a couple of friends who are clerics who well, at least they didn't complain about the details. So they were helpful too.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Heather, for the question. The next question is just for you, Kathy, and it's from Mariel Bond. And she's wondering, do any of your own ancestors or ancestors' homes make appearances in your novel?
Good question. No. I had thought of giving my grandfather a walk-on, because I have a grandfather who was born on the Isle of Lewis, but I couldn't figure out a way to get him there. So no, none of my actual ancestors' homes figure in the book, but a lot of stories that my dad told me about touring Scotland when he was in the war. He was stationed in Yorkshire and visited his relatives in Scotland and on the Isle of Lewis. Some of those details did make it in to the book.
Now, our next question is for both of you and comes from J.N. English. And she is wondering, what led you to take up writing and why? I imagine that this is a much more complicated answer than we can probably provide, but a brief one, I believe, will do.
Okay. I, as a younger person, like in my 20s, I had kind of wanted to write fiction, but inconveniently, I couldn't think of anything to write or anything I didn't seem to have anything to say. So wisely, I took up another profession and became an archivist and then a freelance historian. But when I got a little bit older, this idea kind of seized me when I was reading this book that I'd mentioned earlier by C.W. Gordon. When you freelance, you occasionally have periods of rest. You have more periods of rest than you would perhaps wish to have, in fact. And in successive periods where I had no work to do, I would pick up this idea and play with it. And then finally, after several years, I decided to just get serious and write the book if I could. So that's kind of how it started.
For me, I really just fell into it after university. I did some freelance writing for local newspapers. Then I went to journalism school, and after that, practiced as a journalist and nonfiction writer for a number of years. And just slowly it occurred to me that maybe I could try fiction, and the mystery genre seemed apt because it has so much structure. At least it appealed to me. I read a lot of mysteries as a child. So that's how I sort of ended up doing it. It hadn't occurred to me, say, when I was 19 or anything like that. So it hadn't crossed my mind.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you, J.N., for the question. An anonymous attendee is asking, what sort of cycling support structure was there in Scotland in 1900? Beyond the tourism elements, I suppose, was cycling common in these areas that are covered in your book?
Surprisingly common. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, people were doing quite amazing things on these bicycles that had no gears. You just had one speed, and of course, the pneumatic tire was invented by a Scot and patented by Dunlop. There were no cars, of course, so this is the golden age of the bicycle at the beginning of the 20th century. And people were using it for transportation and recreation. It was a great way to get around. And it sort of was eclipsed, when the automobile finally did come along, starting in about the teens. Bicycling kind of went into declined slightly. But in terms of support, quite often these books that I mentioned that were made especially as guides for cyclists would point out that in this particular village, the blacksmith has some expertise in bicycle repair. So, if you have a problem with your bike, you go to the blacksmith in Arbroath or whatever. It was a bit primitive, but people were there who were developing expertise in repairing bikes, and the riders themselves had to develop quite a bit of knowledge on how to repair themselves on the road.
Well, thank you. we have 2 more questions in the chat, and I think that will more or less take us to time. And I somehow have found myself in the sun moves across the sky, does it not?
Yes, it does.
A truth in this world. So Catherine, from Wendy Barker, she's wondering if your title is a biblical quote. And if not, how did so many windings come to you as an alternative?
Well, this is a bit complicated. No, it isn't complicated. So Many Windings was suggested by a poem that I put at the beginning of the book, which was from a meditation by the Anglican priest Lancelot Andrews, 17th century priest who was one of the translators of the King James Bible. This is a private meditation of his, which I think is based on a passage from the book of Jeremiah. And the image in the poem characterizes the human heart as an old man who is wound up in 1,000 bandages. Who can know the human heart? It is so mysterious, and it is such a dark place. So he used this image of an old man wrapped in 1,000 bandages, and I just loved that image. So that's where So Many Windings came from, but also I thought about the nature of the roads that my cyclists travel over. I mean, roads in Scotland wind, and plots wind. So I thought it was appropriate.
And I can probably answer for Doug to say that the titles of his Father Christmas books come from the 12 Days of Christmas.
Yes. No surprises there.
So our final question for today, before we wrap up, is from Bev Peters, and she's wondering that besides yourselves and each other in turn, who are some of your favorite mystery writers? Oh, and Bev Peters is certain to let us know that this is not actually a question from Bev, but from Barb Janes.
Well known to me. Well, it won't come as much of a surprise that I read a lot of Scottish mystery writers, and probably my current favorite writer is Ian Rankin. I did like Philip Carr, who unfortunately died last year, I think, who wrote books set in Germany during the Nazi era. His detective is, I think, Willie Gunther. Excellent books. Louise Penny, I like Louise Penny. Yeah, Doug, your turn.
Oh, well, I guess I've tended always to read mostly the British mystery writers. A lot of the ones I've always liked for years, of course, have died. Of course, like P.D. James or Ruth Rendell, I've loved their stuff very much, but they're gone. More contemporary people would be like Denise. Have you read Denise? It's Mina or Mina. She's a Scottish writer. I like Kate Atkinson. Her Jackson Brodie ones fall into the mystery category, but they're quite different in a way. I like their unconventionality of them and the aspects of his character. There's another British one, Susie. Oh, Michael, maybe you know who it is. Susie
Steiner. Susie Steiner.
Susie Steiner.
Yes, who has 3 books in her series. All of these books, I should say, are available for new and used purchasing at
Else than you.
Well, I don't ask the questions. I just provide the answers. Yeah, I mean, like if either of you wish, I can reveal to the world a larger depth of your purchasing history, but I think it's probably safe for us to leave that aside. As to who my favorite crime writers are, I have a shop full of them, so it's hard to make obvious choices because I don't want to influence anybody unduly. We're coming up to the hour, and I would like to again thank everybody joining us in the audience, and not thank the sun for being quite as intrusive here. I think if we go any longer, the sun is going to get into Catherine's face as well as we watch it traverse across her bookcases. But first, thank you, Doug, as CC Benison. We should note that one of Doug's books, Paul is Dead, this one here in my hand, is going to be featured as a McNally Robinson Book Club book for June. But if you, for example, like to support slightly smaller independent mystery bookstores, is available for purchase at Whodunit Mystery Bookshop. And of course, his most recent book through At Bay Press is The Unpleasantness at the Battle of Thornford. And as I move over here, we are here, of course, and thank you as well, Catherine, to celebrate Put On So Many Windings, the newest hardcover for Catherine Mcdonald, the second in the Charles Lauchlan series. And you can buy that as of now, and there will be more signed copies as of tomorrow at a time to be secretly determined by me and Catherine. And also the first book of the series, Put On the Armour of Light, now in rights owned by At Bay Press, although originally published in the first ever non-black and white version of Dundurn mystery novels. I would like to also thank Matt at Bay for doing all of the background stuff, making all of this work, except for the fact that he didn't come and block the sun in my office. And with that, thank you, Doug.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you, Michael.
And I will pass it on to Matt for the end stages of the evening.
Well, thanks, Michael. It's just such a thrill to launch this book and to have worked with Catherine on this book. I've been a huge fan of Catherine's work for many, many years. And it started with Put On the Armour of Light. The interesting story that I'll quickly tell here to recap the evening is that I was selected by the Manitoba Book Awards to be the judge the year that Catherine's book won for Put On the Armour of Light. And I was a huge fan of the book and had no idea that somewhere down the road, many years down the road, I would be publishing her second book in the series. And then shortly after that, acquiring the rights to the first book in the series. So it was, it's funny how the world works, and just so thrilled to have been able to work with Catherine on this great book. And then, of course, to have worked with Doug again on this book as he was substantive editor. Yeah, just a lot of fun, and it's such a pleasure to be able to put these books out into the world and to be able to see such great attendance like this tonight from all over. So thanks to everybody for coming out and supporting the arts, supporting these great authors, supporting our local bookstores like Whodunit, who have fought the good fight throughout COVID-19 and who continue to make these wonderful things to keep us, keep our minds off of things. So with that, I just want to say, stay healthy, be well, and a big round of applause, virtual applause, for our host, Michael Bumstead, for our guest, CC Benison, Doug Whiteway, and of course, the person of the evening, Catherine Mcdonald. Yeah, buy the book. Get copies of the book. It is a beautiful book. Read the book.
Can I just have a final word here?
Of course.
Thank you, Matt, for just a great publishing relationship and for producing such a beautiful book. I mean, it's so nice in the hand and so nicely designed. I just really am very grateful to you for that.
Oh, well, it's absolutely our pleasure, Catherine. Yeah, thank you for working with us. So Anybody else? Any other final comments? Okay, well, you know what? Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening. Take care. Bye for now.
Fine.